So there are a lot of moments in Naruto that I reference that hold great importance to the greater timeline, but haven't been fleshed out to the degree that you or I would like. The downfall of the Uzumaki clan, the disappearance of the Senju, or the Great Shinobi World Wars. And while obviously the fourth war got its own arc, the other three are referenced rather often throughout the course of Naruto, but never truly fleshed out, which is crazy to me considering the fact that they literally sculpted the timeline that we observed in Naruto and still in Boruto. And this isn't to say we don't have information on them. We do, not as much as we would like a TV show about Minato that would cover both the second and the third Great Ninja Wars, but what do I know? But because we do know a little bit, and I know more than most people, that's what this video is here to do, to tell you about the first Shinobi World War, or as they called it, the Shinobi World War. They didn't know there was going to be a second one, or a third one, or a fourth one. But before we talk about the first Shinobi World War, let's first do something. Like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. So I'd like to say, before we get into talking about the first Great Shinobi World War, that this truly was not the first great conflict on the continent. This is simply called the first Great Shinobi World War because it was the first war that involved the 5 newly formed ninja nations. I mean, the timeline before the ninja villages were created was literally called the Warring States period, where the Senjus and the Uchihas battled, where the Hozukis and the Hoshikages battled. This war brought nothing new in terms of conflict. It just brought different teams to the field. And sure, you can say, well, these teams were much larger because now we're not dealing with individual clans, we're dealing with amalgamations of clans fighting other amalgamations of clans, and you would be right. But for hundreds of years, these clans had seen the clans that they were fighting on the battlefields for the most part. And while a good amount of these clans did become allies, like the Uchiha and the Senju, a lot of these people have been killing each other for a long time. Why did this war start? We just got done with the Warring States period, and we just had the 5 Kage meet, split up all of the tailed beasts. What's happening here? And while that is absolutely true, the 5 Kage did meet as the formation of the ninja villages was occurring, and Hashirama beseeched upon each of them to bring in an era of peace. And he was a man of his word in this regard by handing out tailed beasts to every single village that he had captured, except of course to the Hidden Sand, who had already captured Shukaku and therefore demanded monetary compensation from Hashirama. But to every other village, he handed out tailed beasts as a show of faith. Kind of just seems like a flex to me though. It's like, I'm so much stronger than you, I can hand you this literal amalgamation of chakra that is likened to a natural disaster in a beast form, and I don't even have to worry about it, because if you try and use it on me, I'll just catch it again. Like, these people were just fighting. They are battling for territory, for resources, and he was like, yeah, here, take these scariest things on earth, try and use it against me. I dare you. So how, in a matter of 10 or so years, did we go from that 5 Kage summit to the beginning of the first Great Shinobi World War? We don't necessarily know for sure why the battle started. There's no concrete moment. There's no Franz Ferdinand. But we got a little bit of insight from Inoki. Yes, Inoki is so old, he can remember why the first Great Shinobi World War started. Kind of puts into perspective how short the timeline of all known events in Naruto history is. It really goes like Kaguya, Hagoromo, Hamura, 2,000 years, Warring State period for like 100 years, and then it's like hidden villages. And those have only been around for like 80 years. But the insight that Inoki gave to us about the first Great Shinobi World War is that essentially it started because hidden villages and their countries were trying to take resources from other hidden villages and countries. And to assume something like this was going to happen is not that crazy, considering the fact that in that very first Kage meeting, Redo, the first Kazekage, demanded that because they already had Shukaku and they didn't need one of Hashirama's handout, that Hashirama would instead give them part of Konoha's fertile land and 30% of all the money that the other hidden villages would pay to Hashirama for these tailed beasts. Because Hashirama wasn't handing those beasts out for free. He actually used catching these tailed beasts as a way to fund Konoha to make it the prosperous village it is now. So from the very get-go, there had already been a blueprint laid out that some villages needed resources more deeply than others. The Hidden Sand not having fertile land, considering it literally is in a desert. But ironically, it wouldn't be the Hidden Sand who would kick off this war. Oddly enough, it was Konoha. Konoha, the village that just sold 7 tailed beasts for the price of God knows how much, who's located in a forest surrounded by fertile land. But Konoha had something that none of the other villages had, and that was Madara. Madara Uchiha. You see, the reason that Madara didn't become the Hokage and Hashirama did is because they had very different approaches to what a person in power should be. Konoha was a point of pride for both Madara and Hashirama. But Hashirama wanted to rule in an era of peace. He didn't want to war with other nations and take their lands. He thought power resided in the ability to build for those under you. This is why he secured the funding by catching the tailed beasts and selling them. So he could use it to build walls around Konoha, streets, infrastructure, plumbing, these kinds of things. But that was diametrically opposed to the way that Madara thought power should act. You see, Madara's pride for Konoha meant that he loved Konoha so much he wanted to share it with everybody else. Essentially, Madara wanted to take control of every other ninja village because he thought Konoha was so far superior that they would be better suited if Konoha was in control of them. Think of Hashirama kind of like Switzerland. He was neutral and he focused on his people. And because of that, he built a very rich and wealthy and happy country. Think of Madara like a more colonializing country, Britain or United States, who figured that having more people under them would mean more power and therefore a better system for everybody. And because Madara thought like this and was also in a position of power, being Hashirama's shadow Hokage, it started to cause problems. The biggest of which is when he demanded that the hidden stone become subservient to Konoha. Madara saw the hidden stone as the weakest of all of the hidden villages, which wasn't the craziest assumption of all time, considering that the hidden stone had very little fertile land, and therefore probably the weakest economy out of all the hidden villages. However, shinobi from the hidden stone have a rock-hard disposition. The second they are given an order by their commanding officers, they will follow that order even if it means death. So Madara demanding that this very prideful city become Konoha's simply because it doesn't have a good economy and Konoha is vastly superior to it, well, it didn't tickle him the right way. This, amongst several other events implied by Inoki, were said to cause the start of the First Great Shinobi World War. But before we get into the actual beginning of the war and the implications and who fought in it, we should talk about the buildup. Yes, as we touched on earlier, Hashirama distributed the tailed beasts among the hidden villages, and this caused an end to all of the smaller wars. Skirmishes on borders, things like this. But what it didn't do was stop escalation. In fact, it directly caused it. Because believe it or not, if you give a bunch of nations nuclear weapons and say, hey, please don't use this, we're kind of cool now, they're probably gonna use it. So while these small skirmishes on borders over small things did come to an end, larger battles began to occur. Larger battles that required more manpower, stronger shinobi, and this escalated into a fever pitch. Essentially, all of the hidden villages now had to strive to become the strongest. And this also meant that the village's strongest shinobis had to be on the front lines. And this was unfortunate for Hashirama, because as these small skirmishes began to become full-blown battles, Hashirama had to be there to protect his people. Especially when you consider the fact that these villages in these skirmishes were now using tailed beasts, something that only Hashirama was able to lock down. I mean, at this point, the Uzumakis could also do it. They were still alive, but you get what I'm saying. So now Hashirama, the leader of Konoha, is out there fighting these battles. And at this point, Madara has already been exiled and subsequently killed by Hashirama. So Madara is not out there helping Hashirama. So subsequently, one day when Hashirama is leading his Konoha forces in these almost warlike battles, he dies.
But how does he die, Nick? Does the first Kage, who looks like Jimi Hendrix for some reason, lightning through his chest?
Well, first off, I'd like to say at this point, Hashirama was in his late 50s, early 60s. So he wasn't as powerful as he might have been at one point in his life, but essentially Hashirama died in a way very similar to the third Kage. In order to cover the retreat of an entire Konoha platoon, Hashirama stood as a decoy. We don't know who he was fighting, we just know he was fighting. And he fought this group of enemy shinobi for 24 hours straight, effectively allowing his platoon to retreat as far as necessarily possible. And at the end of these 24 hours, he died of chakra depletion. That's it. No legendary shinobi speared him. He didn't die in a legendary battle against one of the tailed beasts he had handed out. Eventually, he just ran out of chakra, which makes a lot of sense when you consider the fact that he's basically unkillable with his healing factor. That is, until, of course, that healing factor runs out of chakra. Well, shit. Now, the first Hokage is dead. The guy who was advocating for peace this entire time, and he was killed by an enemy nation. It's gonna be pretty hard to avoid war at this point. But that's actually exactly what Tobirama tried to do as he stepped up as the second Hokage. See, Tobirama loved his brother Hashirama and wanted to continue his pursuit of peace. And this isn't necessarily a well understood aspect of Tobirama. Everybody is just like, Tobirama the racist, he hates Uchihas and he loves battle. And while, yes, he had a deep-seated love for his brother and also idealized his brother's views. I mean, shit, if you had seen this man single single-handedly bring the Uchiha, the people you had hated your entire life, into the village, get them to throw out Madara, the dude you've hated your entire life, and then kind of avoid a war with all these other villages after catching the nine-tailed beast, you'd probably idealize him too. But Tobirama was only human, and the war was basically already starting. Superpowered nations were now fighting other superpowered nations for fertile land, assets, rivers, bridges, these kinds of things. And before you knew it, full-on war. As to what happens in this war and who's fighting in it, we don't really know, but we can make a couple of calculated assumptions. I lied. There is one thing that we know, and it's that this war devastated every single country that was involved, mostly in the way of leaders dying. Obviously, Hashirama at this point is already dead, but we know that Tobirama also dies in this war later at the hands of the Kinkaku Ginkaku strike force. But this raises a lot of questions. So before we get to Tobirama's death, which is effectively the end of the war, we have to talk about some things that would have happened because Tobirama was alive when they happened. Look at the war arc for a second. Mu, the second Tsuchikage, you know, the zombie man with all the mummy wrappings. When he and the other Kage are revived using Edo Tensei, he says this must have been Tobirama who did this. And that assumption makes a lot of sense because Tobirama is the person who created Edo Tensei, but Mu's soul has been in the Pure Land, aka Naruto Heaven, and it has no conception of time. As far as Mu knows, he could have been dead a week, a day, tens of years. All he knows is that he died and that he is now back alive. But him implying that Tobirama is the person who brought him and all the other Kage back to life implies that Tobirama was still around when Mu died. A dead person wouldn't be able to bring them back with Edo Tensei. But here's the thing about Mu's death. Gengetsu, the second Mizukage, died when Mu died. They killed each other, they traded, which would imply a couple of things. One, that Gengetsu was also dead before Tobirama, but two, possibility that the Hidden Stone and the Hidden Mist were at war in the First Great Shinobi World War. Otherwise, why would Gengetsu and Mu, who infamously didn't like each other, be fighting? What's interesting about that, though, is that the Hidden Stone and the Hidden Mist are about as far apart from each other as they literally can be. The Hidden Stone is in the northwest, while the Hidden Mist is an island off the southeast. But if we use a little deductive reasoning here, it actually makes a bit of sense. You see, these two had to be battling. We know that. And slapped directly between those two countries is the Land of Fire. This could help explain why the Land of Fire was dragged into this war in the first place when they wanted to be peaceful. Because here's the thing, the fact that Konoha and the Land of Fire joined this war doesn't make a whole lot of sense. One, everybody was afraid of them. Madara had essentially gone around most of the villages and yelled at them for not being subservient to Konoha. But here's the thing, most of those people listened. In fact, it's heavily implied when Madara went to the Hidden Stone to tell Mu and Inoki that they should be subservient to Konoha that he battled both of those people. And then take into account the fact that Hashirama and Madara were leading this village and that eventually their battle would be so powerful and terrifying that it would literally create the final valley. And you have a very scary country. Luckily, that country didn't want war, they wanted peace. So how does a country like this get dragged into a war? Well, more likely than not, either the forces from the Hidden Stone or the forces from the Hidden Mist had to travel through the Land of Fire to get to their enemies. The simple act of traversing troops through the Land of Fire would be enough to get them to join the war. But then you take into account that more likely than not, that the Land of Fire was a place where a lot of these battles occurred. And when you take into account a couple of other things that happened in the war, this theory makes even more sense. The most important point that bolsters this theory is the fact that Tobirama went to the village hidden in the clouds and tried to make an agreement, a peace treaty between him and the second Raikage. Which, by the way, the fact that Tobirama was chatting with the second Raikage, not the first, would imply that the first Raikage also died in this war. Oh, and because Gengetsu was now second Mizukage, that would also imply that the first Mizukage died in this war. And the same thing with the first Tsuchi Kage, because Mu was in charge. So now, the Hokage, the Tsuchi Kage, the Kaze Kage, and the Mizokages have all died in this war. Everyone except for the Hidden Sand is confirmed to be on their second leader. But we'll get to Redo in a second. Back to the peace treaty. Tobirama travels to the village hidden in the clouds to meet with A, the second Raikage. And while he's there to strike a peace treaty, he's attacked by Kinkaku and Ginkaku, who are trying to assassinate not only him, but the second Raikage. Kinkaku and Ginkaku didn't want peace between the two villages. They had hate in their heart for the village hidden in the leaves. And when you think about it, it makes a little bit of sense considering they had been consumed whole by Kurama and also had been fighting them for a while, considering the fact that the Hidden Cloud and Konoha are almost neighbors. There's like two small small nations between them. Fortunately, neither the second Raikage or Tobirama are assassinated in this attempt, and Tobirama returns to the Hidden Leaf, unfortunately not being able to strike a peace treaty. But why was Tobirama trying to have a peace treaty specifically with the Hidden Cloud? Because if Tobirama was able to get that peace treaty signed, he would have effectively been able to shut down the area that the Hidden Mist or the Hidden Stone travel through to get to each other. The most direct line from the Hidden Mist to the Hidden Stone goes directly between the cloud and the leaf. With the formulation of a peace treaty there and the combined forces of these two nations, they would effectively be able to stop the war. But unfortunately, didn't happen. This is where the First Great Shinobi World War gets a bit weird, because Kinkaku and Ginkaku just tried to assassinate both the second Raikage and Tobirama and destroyed what could have been a peace treaty that stopped the war. So they are exiled from the Hidden Cloud, which makes the next and final event of the First Great Shinobi World War not make a whole lot of sense. The next real thing we know that happens in the First Great Shinobi World War is Tobirama's death. Tobirama is out with his escort team on a mission in the Hidden Cloud because they didn't get the peace treaty, so still a war going on. And Tobirama's out there with Danzo, Hiruzen, Shisui's grandfather. And being an incredible sensor-type ninja, he realizes there's 20 ninjas approaching their location right now. Realizing the chakra signatures of both Kinkaku and Ginkaku, who he had struggled with during the assassination attempt, he realized that somebody was gonna have to stay behind to act as a decoy. Tobirama then asks everybody who wants to be the decoy. Hiruzen steps up, Danzo's mad he didn't step up, and Tobirama was like, psych, I'm gonna stay behind. That was to see who's gonna be my successor. So he makes Hiruzen the third Hokage. But the thing is, I just told you about how Kinkaku and Ginkaku were no longer part of the Hidden Cloud. They were essentially rogue ninja who were still fighting in the war with the Hidden Cloud. And it wasn't just the two of them, they had a strike force of 18 other people, and they hunted Tobirama down. Now you could say this is possibly just them acting on their own and trying to enact their will to swing the war in the way that they want it to go. That's fair, but they tried to assassinate the second Raikage. They shouldn't have free reign in the Hidden Cloud at all. Or maybe they're the Itachi of the Hidden Cloud and they look like they've been ostracized, but they actually haven't. I really don't know the actual answer, but the idea of rogue ninjas still fighting for their village in a war, it's just, the whole thing is weird to me. But regardless of their motivations, they killed Tobirama. So now Konoha is down 2 Kage and everyone else except for the Hidden Sand is down 1. The continent is in shambles. The First Great Shinobi World War was actually written to mirror the First World War and what it did to Europe. And very similarly to World War I, an armistice was signed, and there was 20 years of peace before there was another world war. But why was the armistice signed? Was everyone like,
okay, we can't just keep popping out Kages like this?
Or was it that another Kage died? You see, we've been talking about how Redo, the first Kage, was the only person not to die, right? Redo, the guy who demanded that Hashirama give him 30% of the money he was making on all of the tail beasts he was selling. Oh, and on top of that, I want some of Konoha's fertile land. Kind of ridiculous terms to ask for peace. And as he was known to be an incredibly stubborn man, I doubt he ever backed down from these terms. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense because the Hidden Sand is tucked away. With the Hidden Leaf fighting the Hidden Cloud, there was no one really looking at the Hidden Sand. So it's safe to assume they didn't incur massive losses during this war. But because Redo wouldn't budge on these terms and nobody was going to satisfy them for him, the war continued. But we do know something about Redo, and it's that he was assassinated. And he was the first Kage to start what would be the curse of the Kages, where every single Kage is assassinated. But why was he assassinated? Probably because he wouldn't let the war end. So more likely than not, there was an uprising in the Hidden Sand that ended in Redo's death, and therefore the subsequent signing of an armistice. And just like that, we have the close of the First Great Shinobi World War. Well, yes, a lot of this is speculation. I'm willing to admit that. There is definitive points in the Naruto storyline that we've seen, whether intentional or not from Kishimoto, that we can use to draw lines and infer things. So if you liked my iteration of the First Great Shinobi World War, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Did you think you were going to be signing up for a class called Naruto Geography today? You didn't? Well, it's the beauty of this page.